Hey everyone, tonight we're uncovering the truth about Europe's green hills. Those ancient burial mounds aren't just graves, but doorways to realms where Bronze Age kings still hold court and time moves differently than the world above. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover why every culture warns against opening the barrows, and let me know in the comments if you've ever felt watched near an ancient hill. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore the hollow hills where disturbing the wrong stone can curse entire bloodlines. Without further ado, let's begin. The light comes once a year. On the winter solstice, when the world balances on the knife's edge between life and death, a single shaft of golden fire pierces the darkness of Newgrange. For 17 precious minutes, sunlight crawls down the stone passage like a living thing, reaching deep into the earth's belly to touch bones that have waited 5,000 years. The builders knew this would happen. They carved their doorway with the precision of clockmakers, aligning stone and shadow to capture that one moment when the dying sun promises its return. They understood what we have forgotten, that the dead hunger for light, and on the year's darkest day, they must be fed. This is where it begins, not with ghosts or fairy tales, but with stone and bone and the terrible love of those who refuse to let go. 5,000 years ago, they moved mountains for their dead. The great mound at Newgrange rises from the Irish countryside like a green breast, its white quartz facing catching morning light and throwing it back transformed. But beneath that gentle curve lies something harder than iron, older than memory. A passage tomb built from stones that each weigh more than houses, hauled across impossible distances by people who left no written word to explain their devotion. They built for eternity. The corbelled roof of the inner chamber curves overhead like a stone sky, each block placed with such precision that no mortar binds them, yet no rain has touched the bones below in 50 centuries. The spiral carvings that dance across the entrance stone speak in a language of circles and curves, telling stories we can no longer read, but somehow still feel. This was never just a grave. This was architecture for the afterlife. Walk the passage at Newgrange and your footsteps echo in the darkness ahead and behind, as if the tunnel stretches both ways into infinity. The walls press close, carved with patterns that seem to shift in the half-light, spirals within spirals, circles that birth other circles, the mathematics of eternity worked in stone. At the passage's heart, 3 chambers branch like the arms of a cross, each holding stone basins where the cremated dead were placed like offerings on an altar. But cremation was only part of their mystery. At Newgrange, at West Kennet, at barrows across the ancient world, they mixed the burned with the whole. Charred bone fragments nestled against intact skulls, ash scattered over articulated skeletons. The living dead and the truly dead, sharing the same sacred space. As if they knew that death comes in degrees, that some part of us burns away while another part waits, watching, remembering. The mound builders were architects of memory. At West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, the stone chambers stretch like rooms in a house where no one living was ever meant to dwell. For 1,000 years, they returned to these rooms, generation after generation, carrying their honoured dead down the long stone corridor to lay them among their ancestors. The bones tell the story. Old burials pushed aside to make room for new ones, skulls arranged in neat rows like a parliament of the dead, long bones stacked like cordwood against the walls. They didn't abandon their dead to the earth and walk away. They came back, again and again, carrying offerings, pottery bowls still stained with food, flint tools worn smooth by living hands, jewelry that caught firelight in the darkness below. The dead were still part of the community, still hungry, still in need of gifts from those who walked in sunlight. The chambers themselves speak of this ongoing relationship. Stone shelves carved to hold specific bones, niches designed for offerings, passages wide enough for processions of mourners, but narrow enough that each visit felt like a journey into the underworld. These were not tombs in any sense we understand. They were houses for the dead, with all the complex etiquette that relationships with the departed require. At Bryn Celli Dhu on Anglesey, spirals carved into the living rock lead the eye ever inward, deeper into the earth's embrace. The mound sits on an island that the Romans called Mona, the sacred heart of Celtic Britain, but the spirals are older than any Celt. They speak in the universal language of labyrinth and womb, of journeys that end where they began but forever changed. They aligned their dead with eternity, across Britain and Ireland, across the megalithic world from Orkney to Malta. The mound builders were astronomers of death. They positioned their passages to capture not just the winter solstice at Newgrange, but the equinoxes, the rising of particular stars, the complex dance of moon and sun that marks the passage of cosmic time. The dead were made part of this eternal clockwork. At May Show in Orkney, the midwinter sun illuminates a chamber built with such precision that its light falls exactly where it was intended 30 centuries ago. At Gavrinis in Brittany, the passage aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, but the stones themselves are covered with carvings that map the movements of Venus across the sky. They understood something we have lost, that death is not the opposite of life, but part of its rhythm, like winter and summer, like the phases of the moon. The dead were not expelled from the world of light and time, but made participants in its deepest patterns. In their stone chambers, surrounded by offerings and aligned with the stars, they kept their place in the great wheel that turns from darkness into light and back again. This was the first and greatest magic, making death into a doorway rather than a wall. The earth became their afterlife because they made it so. At Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, the largest human-made mound in ancient Europe rises like a stepped pyramid from the chalk downs. No burial has ever been found at its heart, despite excavations that have probed its depths for centuries. But absence is its own presence. Silbury stands as pure monument, the idea of the sacred hill distilled to its essence, a mountain made by human hands, a place set apart from the ordinary world. They didn't just bury their dead in hills. They built hills to be their afterlife. The mound builders carved their names not in stone tablets, but in the landscape itself. Every hill they raised, every passage they aligned with the stars, every chamber they filled with bones and offerings was a declaration. We were here, we mattered, we continue. They transformed the very earth into memory, making the dead part of the bedrock of the world. In the circular barrows of the Bronze Age, in the long barrows of the Neolithic, in the passage graves of Atlantic Europe, the same truth echoes across millennia. The dead don't disappear, they become the foundation on which the living stand. They sink into the earth not to be forgotten, but to be remembered in the deepest possible way, written into the bones of the world itself. This is why their mounds still rise from modern fields like green islands in a sea of wheat. This is why, 5,000 years later, the solstice light still finds its way to the waiting bones at Newgrange. This is why something in us quickens when we see an ancient barrow on the horizon, why we feel the pull of reverence mixed with unease. The mound builders succeeded in their great work. They made the earth itself into their afterlife, and in doing so, they made their dead immortal. But immortality, as we shall see, comes with a price. The hills hold what was given to them. The earth keeps faith with those who trusted it with their bones. And in the long millennia that followed, as new peoples walked the same paths and wondered at the same green mounds, something began to stir in the darkness below. The dead, it seems, had learned to listen, and eventually they began to speak. In the whisper of wind through barrow grass, in the strange dreams that come to those who sleep too close to ancient graves, in the stories that grew like flowers from the fertile soil of memory, the voices of the mound builders echo still. They built their afterlife in earth and stone, but they built it so well that it outlasted their bodies, their culture, their very names. The first graves became the first doorways, and doors once opened are not easily closed. The light fades at Newgrange, retreating down the passage like a tide of gold flowing back to its source. For another year, the dead will wait in darkness, patient as only the truly eternal can be. But they have learned patience from the stones themselves, and stones are very good teachers. Tomorrow, other visitors will come. Some will stand at the entrance and feel only the weight of history, the impressive achievement of ancient engineering. But others, those with older eyes perhaps, or younger hearts, will sense something more. In the spiral carvings that seem to move in peripheral vision, in the way sound behaves strangely in the passage, in the sudden hush that falls when cloud shadow crosses the mound, they will feel the presence of something that chose never to leave. The first graves taught us that death could be transformed, but they also taught us that transformation, once begun, has a life of its own. The word Sídhe means two things at once. It means the mound, the green hill that rises from the Irish countryside, ancient and patient, crowned with hawthorn trees and ringed with stones worn smooth by countless hands. But it also means the beings who dwell within, the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who retreated into the hollow hills when mortal men claimed the upper world. In the old tongue, place and spirit are one. The mound is alive because it is inhabited, and it is inhabited because the dead refuse to be only dead. This is what happened to the ancient graves. Time flowed over them like water, wearing away the names of their builders, the rites that sanctified them, the very memory of who lay within. But the power remained. In Ireland, in Wales, in Scotland and Brittany, across all the Celtic lands where the barrows brooded on their hills, new stories grew from the fertile soil of forgetting. The ancestors became something else, something beautiful and terrible and forever watchful from their throne rooms carved in stone. The fair folk had found their palaces, and sometimes, on nights when the veil between worlds grows gossamer thin, they still hold court in the darkness below. Listen. On Samhain Eve, when October dies and November draws its first breath, walk the hills of Ireland and you might hear it, music that has no earthly source, floating up from the Sídhe like smoke from a fire that casts no light. The old people knew that sound. They would cross themselves and hurry past, their footsteps quick on the ancient paths, because they understood what the music meant. The doors of the hollow hills were opening. The fair ones were dancing in their halls of stone and bone, and mortals who lingered too long might find themselves drawn down into revels that last 100 years. But there were always those who couldn't resist the song. In County Clare, they tell of Oisin, son of Fionn, who followed the Lady Niamh to Tir na Nog, the land of the young that lies beneath the hill. 3 years he spent in that realm of eternal spring, dancing in halls where the dead kings of Ireland still hold their feasts, where the wine never sours and the music never ends. When homesickness finally drove him back to the world of men, he found that 3 centuries had passed above. His father was dust, his warriors were legend, and when his foot touched mortal ground, the weight of all those stolen years fell upon him like a landslide. He crumbled to ash before the horror in his eyes could fully form. Time moves differently in the hollow hills. A single night of fairy revelry might last a mortal lifetime. A century in the Sídhe might pass like the space between heartbeats. The fair folk are masters of the stolen moment, the borrowed hour, the promise that this time, this one perfect time, will last forever. But forever has a price, and the price is always higher than mortals expect to pay. This is the first rule of fairy dealings. What goes down into the hill doesn't come back unchanged, if it comes back at all. The hills themselves seem to know their new reputation. Across the Celtic world, ancient burial mounds wear their fairy names like masks, names that hint at the power sleeping below. In Ireland, the Hill of 3 Sorrows, the Mound of the Hostages, the Fort of the Nuts, where Lugh is said to hold court with the greatest of the Tuatha De Danann. In Wales, the mounds of glass beneath which Arthur himself is said to sleep. waiting for Britain's greatest need. In Scotland, the hollow hills of Elfhame, where Thomas the Rhymer spent 7 years learning the language of prophecy from the Queen of Fairies herself. But the most telling names are the simplest ones: the quiet mound, the watching hill, the place where no birds sing. Even in forgetting, the people remembered enough to be afraid. Medieval priests fought a losing battle against the old beliefs. Church records from across Celtic lands tell the same frustrated story. Villagers who would not abandon the heathen hills, who still left offerings at the bases of ancient mounds, who gathered on certain nights to light fires on barrow tops despite threats of excommunication. In Brittany, the Bishop of Saint-Malo raged against farmers who left bread and milk at the Corrigan stones. In Ireland, clerics thundered from their pulpits against the devil fires that bloomed like earthbound stars on Samhain Eve, each flame marking a seed where the old powers stirred. The church tried to sanctify what it could not destroy. Crosses were planted atop burial mounds like stakes through a vampire's heart, and pagan sites received Christian names: St. Patrick's Hill, St. Brigid's Mound, the Holy Well of the Three Saints. But the stones remember older blessings, and the fair folk are not so easily evicted from their ancient homes. The crosses lean at drunken angles now, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, while the mounds beneath them remain as patient as ever. In the contest between Christian steel and pagan stone, stone has proved the more enduring. The fairy faith evolved, but it never died. Instead, it learned to speak in whispers. Each region developed its own dialect of wonder and warning. In Ireland, the Sídhe were a royal people, beautiful and proud and quick to take offence. Disturb their mounds and face their wrath. Show them proper respect and they might grant boons. A silver cup that never empties, a harp that plays itself, a sword that never misses its mark. But always, always, their gifts came with conditions that mortals discovered only after it was too late. In Wales, the hollow hills belonged to the Tylwyth Teg, the fair family, whose beauty was so terrible that mortals who glimpsed them were struck blind by longing. The Welsh hills were particularly hungry for human children, and the stories of changelings left in place of stolen babies grew as thick as brambles around the ancient barrows. A baby who cried too much, who seemed too clever or too strange, might be whispered to be one of the fair folk's substitutes, while somewhere in the hollow hills, mortal children danced to music that would break their parents' hearts. In Scotland, the fairy hills sheltered a more martial court. The Sluagh, the restless host of the unforgiven dead, rode out from their barrows on the night wind, seeking souls to add to their endless army. But even more feared were the still courts deep within the hills, where the seelie and unseelie held their ancient grudges and made their impossible bargains. The Scottish borderlands were thick with stories of mortals lured into the hollow hills, where they served 7 years as pages or lovers, or entertainment for the ageless nobility of the underground realm. But all the variations circled back to the same fundamental truth. The hills were alive, and what lived within them was not entirely safe for mortal contact. The calendar of fairy activity mapped itself onto the old ritual year. On Beltane Eve, when the hawthorns bloomed white as bone, the Sídhe would open to release their inhabitants into the world above. On Samhain, when the veil between worlds grew thin as spider silk, the fair folk would draw back into their hills, but leave their doors ajar for any mortals bold or foolish enough to follow. The solstices and equinoxes, the cross-quarter days, the nights when the moon was dark or full, all became times of particular danger and particular opportunity for those who knew how to read the signs. The mounds themselves became a ritual calendar written in earth and stone. Walk sunwise around a fairy hill and you might glimpse wonders. Walk widdershins and court disaster. Approach with an offering and find favor. Come with iron in your pocket and face the fury of beings who remember when the world was bronze and gold. The ancient barrows developed their own etiquette, rules that were never written down, but passed like secrets from grandmother to granddaughter, from shepherd to shepherd, from one generation of believers to the next. And still, despite all warnings, there were always those who could not resist the lure of the Hollow Hills. The stories they brought back, when they brought back stories at all, painted pictures of realms that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, where the dead kings of ancient times still held court in halls carved from living crystal. They spoke of feasts where the food was light itself, of music that rewrote the listener's very soul, of dances that lasted centuries but felt like moments. They described libraries where every book that was ever written and all the books that never were sat waiting to be read. Gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, fountains that flowed with liquid starlight. But they also whispered of darker wonders, of mortals who had been too long in the Hollow Hills and were no longer quite human, their eyes reflecting light like water in deep caves, of fairy nobles who collected human lovers like butterflies, pinning them to display cases of amber and gold, of the sounds that echoed through the endless corridors of the Sídhe, not just music and laughter, but weeping and screaming and the hollow rattle of chains. The fair folk, it seemed, were no more uniformly benevolent than they were uniformly evil. They were simply powerful, and power without mortal restraint tends toward extremes. As Christianity strengthened its hold on Celtic lands, the fairy faith evolved in response. The fair folk became more hidden, more subtle in their manifestations. They learned to work through dreams and visions, through sudden inspiration and inexplicable compulsion. The grand processions of the Sídhe dwindled to glimpses caught from the corner of the eye, to shadows that moved against the light, to voices heard in the wind between the hawthorn trees. But the hills remained, green and patient and watchful, rising from modern fields like memories made manifest. The mounds that had once sheltered the bones of Bronze Age chieftains now harbored stories of fairy courts and otherworldly revelry. The dead had become the deathless, and their ancient graves had become palaces of eternal possibility. This transformation tells us something important about the nature of sacred ground. Power, once established, does not simply disappear when its original context is forgotten. Instead, it finds new forms, new stories, new ways to make itself known to each generation. The barrow builders' greatest achievement was not their sophisticated engineering or their astronomical alignments, but their success in marking certain places as forever other, forever set apart from the mundane world. The fairy hills are what happens when ancient power outlives ancient knowledge, when the specific becomes the archetypal, when the historical becomes the mythical, when the dead become the deathless. The Sídhe remember what we have forgotten, that some places exist outside the normal flow of time, and that the boundaries between worlds are thinner than we pretend. In the Hollow Hills, the first graves became the first fairyland, and fairyland, as any student of the old stories knows, is the most dangerous country in the world to visit. Because fairy gifts always come with conditions. Fairy time always exacts its price. And fairy doors, once opened, have a way of leading much deeper into the darkness than anyone expects to go. The sun sets red over the green hills of Ireland, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, a door that is not quite a door creaks open on hinges that make no sound. Music drifts up from passages carved in the bedrock of the world, melodies that promise everything the heart has ever desired and warn of prices the soul was never meant to pay. The fair folk are holding court tonight in the Hollow Hills, and they are always recruiting. The grave should have been empty. Carr had been dead for 3 winters when Grettir and his men broke into the barrow on the windswept heath of Iceland. They came for treasure, as men always do, gold arm rings and silver brooches, the grave goods that glittered in firelight and promised easy wealth to those bold enough to disturb the ancient dead. The barrow stood like a green wound in the black volcanic soil, and the local farmers had warned them away with the fervour of men who had learned fear from their great-great-grandfathers. But Grettir was strong and proud, and certain that dead men posed no threat to the living. He was wrong. When their spades finally broke through into the burial chamber, the smell that rose from the depths was not the clean decay of bones long turned to dust, but something else, something rank and vital and furious. and when they lowered their torches into the darkness, the light fell not on scattered remains, but on Ka himself, sitting upright in his stone chair like a king holding court in the Underworld. His flesh had not rotted but swollen, his skin dark as old leather, his eyes reflecting the flame like black water in deep caves. The corpse spoke one word: leave. Greta, who had never retreated from any battle with the living, found his hand frozen on his sword hilt. Because this was not death as men understood it. This was something that had learned to inhabit death like a house, to wear it like armor, to use the grave as a fortress from which to wage war on the world above. This is what the Nordic peoples knew that the Celts had forgotten in their fairy dreams. Sometimes the dead don't transform into something beautiful. Sometimes they just refuse to die. The Wights of Germanic legend were no ethereal fair folk dancing in crystal halls. They were the hungry dead, the envious dead, the dead who had been cheated of their rest and now cheated others in return. In the great burial mounds of Denmark and Sweden, in the ship graves of Norway, in the barrows scattered across the moors of Iceland, they sat in state among their grave goods like misers counting coins in the dark. Death had made them stronger, not weaker, more present, not less, more dangerous than they had ever been in life. The sagas tell their stories with the matter-of-fact precision of men recording legal disputes. In the Erbygja saga, the dead of Frodiswater rise from their graves to hold ghostly courts in the kitchen of the living, reenacting the social hierarchies of life with the inexorable logic of the truly obsessed. They sit in order of precedence, from the lowest thrall to the greatest jarl, and they will not be dismissed until their business is concluded according to the ancient laws. In Greta's saga, the hero battles not just Ka, but a dozen other barrow dwellers across Iceland and Norway, each one unique in its malevolence, each one guarding its hoard with the focused hatred of the dispossessed. These are not stories of otherworldly enchantment, but of practical horror. The dead as a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized, a force that intrudes on the world of the living with all the subtlety of a landslide. The Wights knew things, secrets buried with them, knowledge that should have died but didn't, memories that festered in the darkness of their barrows like infected wounds. They had seen the world change above them, felt the footsteps of strangers crossing their lands, tasted the fear and greed of those who approached their graves. Some had grown wise in their long watching, others had simply grown mad. All of them had grown hungry. The hunger was not for food. The dead have no need of bread and meat. It was a hunger for life itself, for the warmth and motion and brief bright flame of mortal existence. They fed on the living by draining them, by pulling vitality into themselves like water into a sponge, leaving their victims weakened, aged, sometimes dead. The Wights were vampires before the word existed, parasites that had learned to feast on life force itself, but they were also guardians, protectors of treasures that went deeper than gold and silver. In their swollen bodies and stretched skin, in their supernatural strength and their terrible patience, they embodied the persistence of the past itself. They were what remained when honor and glory faded, when names were forgotten and deeds became legend. They were the bedrock of memory, the foundation that refuses to erode no matter how many centuries pass above. The Vikings understood this. Their barrow breaking was not casual grave robbing, but a form of spiritual warfare, a battle between the claims of the past and the needs of the present. When they entered the mounds with iron in their hands and fire in their hearts, they were not just seeking treasure, but testing themselves against the very principle of persistence. Could the living overcome the dead? Could the new world triumph over the old? Or would the Wights drag them down into the darkness, adding their bones to the hoards that time had already claimed? The tools they carried into the barrows tell the story of hard-won knowledge. Iron, because the Wights feared it, not as a metal, but as a symbol of change, of innovation, of the forward motion that the dead could never share. Rowan wood, because it grew in graveyards and had learned to draw strength from the proximity of death. fire, because it was the opposite of the cold, patient darkness in which the Wights made their homes. And always, the willingness to fight, because the Barrow dwellers respected nothing but strength and would yield to nothing but superior force. The battles were never easy. Carr fought Greta with the strength of 3 men and the cunning of centuries. He could grow larger at will, stretching his dead flesh like clay, could move with the speed of thought through his own domain, could call upon powers that the living had never learned to master. But he was bound to his barrow, chained to the hoard he guarded, limited by the very obsession that gave him strength. This was the weakness that the saga heroes learned to exploit. The Wights were powerful within their domains, but helpless outside them. They were bound by the laws they had known in life, constrained by the social orders they refused to abandon, trapped by the very persistence that made them terrible. They could not change, could not grow, could not adapt to new circumstances. They were fixed points in a flowing world, and eventually the world wore them down. When Greta finally defeated Carr, the Barrow Wight crumbled not into dust, but into nothing. Not death, but the absence of existence itself, as if his refusal to die had been the only thing keeping him tied to the world. The treasure remained, but it was somehow diminished, tarnished by contact with the unnatural will that had guarded it. Gold that had gleamed in torchlight seemed dull in daylight. Silver that had sung with promise fell silent when removed from its bed of bones. This is what the Northern tales teach us about the price of immortality. Persistence without growth becomes stagnation, and stagnation becomes corruption. The Barrow Wights had achieved a kind of eternal life, but it was life frozen at the moment of death, preserved in amber, unable to change or heal or find peace. They were not the blessed immortals of Celtic fairy lore, but the cursed undead of Germanic nightmare. Proof that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not dying, but being unable to die. The tradition of barrow breaking spread wherever the Vikings sailed. In England, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles record heroes who opened the ancient long barrows and fought the giants that dwelt within. In Ireland, the Norsemen who settled there brought their own dark wisdom to the fairy hills, adding stories of Draugr and Wights to the existing lore of the Sídhe. In Orkney and the Shetlands, in the Faroes and Iceland, wherever the northern sea kings established their settlements, the barrows became battlegrounds between the living and the defiantly unalive. But for every Wight that was defeated, 10 others retreated deeper into their mounds, learning caution from their fellows' destruction. The survivors became more subtle, more patient, more willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. They learned to work through dreams and visions, to whisper suggestions into the minds of the greedy and the desperate. They discovered that corruption was often more effective than direct confrontation, that it was easier to make the living serve their will than to fight them openly. The later stories reflect this evolution. The Barrow Wights became less obvious but more insidious, reaching out from their graves to influence events in the world above. A farmer who ploughed too close to an ancient mound might find his crops failing year after year until he moved his fields. A merchant who camped beside a barrow might wake to find his gold transformed to leaves and his silver to stones. Children who played too near the old graves might begin speaking in voices not their own, reciting genealogies of kings dead since the world was young. The Wights had learned patience, and patience, combined with immortality, is perhaps the most dangerous combination in the world. In the great burial mounds of Denmark, archaeologists have found evidence of disturbance and redisturbance spanning centuries. Graves opened and closed, grave goods removed and replaced, bones scattered and rearranged in patterns that suggest purpose rather than random vandalism. The barrows were not just tombs, but active sites, places where the living and the dead engaged in ongoing negotiations that sometimes erupted into open warfare. The Christian Church tried to break this cycle by consecrating the ancient mounds, but the results were mixed at best. Holy water and blessed crosses could drive the Wights deeper into their barrows, but rarely destroyed them entirely. The dead had been in possession too long, had sunk their roots too deeply into the sacred soil of their graves. They simply waited, patient as stones, for the new religion to pass away, as all religions eventually do. Some barrows were abandoned to the Wights entirely. Local knowledge marked them as places where no good Christian should venture, where the old powers still held sway, despite centuries of prayer and exorcism. These became the truly dangerous mounds, the ones where the boundary between worlds had grown so thin that merely approaching them could draw the unwary into the realm of the unquiet dead. But others became sites of ongoing conflict, places where each generation had to prove itself against the patient malevolence of the barrow dwellers. These were the mounds that produced heroes, not because heroism was inherent in those who challenged them, but because only heroes could survive the encounter with forces that had been perfecting their malice for centuries. The Wights taught the living important lessons about the nature of death and the danger of clinging too tightly to life. They showed that immortality without purpose becomes torment, that power without growth becomes corruption, that memory without forgiveness becomes poison. They were cautionary tales made flesh, warnings carved in bone and sinew about what happens when the natural order is disrupted by will alone. Yet they were also guardians of a kind, protectors of the deep past and the old knowledge that each age tries to forget. In their patient vigil over the treasures of the dead, they preserved not just gold and silver, but something more precious, the reminder that the past has claims on the present, that the dead have rights that the living cannot simply ignore, that some things are too important to be left to the mercy of time and change. The barrow Wights were the shadow cast by the mound builders' great work. Where the ancient architects of memory had sought to make death into a doorway, the Wights had made it into a fortress. Where the builders had aligned their tombs with the eternal dance of the stars, the Wights had turned inward, becoming fixed points of obsession in a universe of change. But they were also proof that the builders had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had made their dead immortal, had given them power over the world of the living, had created monuments so potent that they could sustain consciousness across millennia. The Wights were the unintended consequence of that success. Immortality without wisdom, persistence without purpose, memory without mercy. In the northern mists, in the howling wind that scours the barrows clean of grass, in the strange dreams that come to those who sleep too close to the ancient graves, the Wights keep their vigils still. They have learned to be subtle, to work through influence rather than confrontation, to plant seeds of corruption that might not bloom for generations. But they have not learned to die, and perhaps, in the end, that is both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness, the thing that makes them immortal and the thing that ensures their ultimate defeat. Because the living world moves forward, always forward, leaving even the most persistent dead eventually behind. The question is not whether the barrow Wights will finally fade into oblivion. The question is what they will take with them when they go. Fire blooms on the hilltops when October dies. Across the Celtic lands, from the stone circles of Scotland to the dolmens of Brittany, the ancient mounds wear crowns of flame on Samhain Eve. The fires are older than Christianity, older than the Druids, older perhaps than the barrows themselves. They rise from the burial hills, like prayers made visible, like conversations with the dead conducted in the universal language of light and smoke. The church has forbidden them for 1,000 years. The fires burn anyway. In the parish records of medieval Ireland, the same complaint appears year after year, written in the frustrated Latin of priests who cannot understand why their flocks cling to customs that damn their souls. The people persist in lighting devil fires upon the heathen hills, writes the Bishop of Cork in 1347. They gather at sunset on the Feast of All Hallows and kindle flames upon the barrows, claiming they honour the dead. But what dead could be honoured by such pagan rites? The dead who still listen, the people might have answered if they had dared speak truth to ecclesiastical power. The dead who hunger for the warmth they can no longer feel, who thirst for the light they can no longer see. the dead who have been waiting in the darkness of their barrows since before Christ was born, patient as stones, but not as silent. The ritual fires map themselves across the landscape, like stars fallen to earth, each flame marking a mound where the boundary between worlds grows thin. On clear nights, from the high places, you can see them stretching to the horizon. Dozens of fires, hundreds of fires, the entire countryside sparked with points of light that flicker and dance in rhythm with the wind. It is as if the earth itself is celebrating, as if the hills have found their voices and are singing in the only language the dead understand. But Samhain is only the most visible of the hill rituals. Throughout the year, the ancient mounds serve as focal points for a calendar of offerings and observances that predates written history. At Beltane, when the hawthorns bloom and the world shakes off winter's grip, villages across Ireland and Scotland gather at their local barrows to kindle the need fires that will bless their cattle and ensure the year's prosperity. The flames are lit with friction, spark struck from spark in the old way, because fire born of human effort carries more power than fire stolen from existing flames. The mounds become altars for these seasonal celebrations. At the base of each barrow, worn smooth by centuries of reverent feet, offerings accumulate like prayers made tangible. Bowls of milk left for the fair folk, loaves of bread for the hungry dead, flowers woven into garlands and draped over standing stones, coins, at first bronze and silver, later copper and iron, pressed into crevices in the ancient masonry like payments for services rendered. The offerings speak of ongoing relationships, of contracts between the living and the dead that must be renewed with each turning of the wheel. The dead provide protection, wisdom, intercession with the otherworld. The living provide sustenance, remembrance, and the acknowledgement that some powers predate the merely human and deserve their due respect. It is commerce of the most ancient kind, not the exchange of goods, but the exchange of obligations, of mutual need, of recognition that both sides have something the other requires. Walk sunwise around a barrow 3 times at dawn on Midsummer Day, and the dead will grant you sight beyond sight, the ability to see through fairy glamour, to recognize changelings, to know the true names of spirits. Walk widdershins around the same mound at midnight on the winter solstice, and you court disaster, confusion, madness, or worse. The direction matters, the timing matters. The ancient graves have their own etiquette, rules as complex and unforgiving as any royal court. The church tried to redirect these customs toward Christian ends. If the people insisted on lighting fires on hills, let them be fires in honor of saints. If they insisted on leaving offerings at ancient stones, let the offerings be flowers for the Virgin, rather than milk for the pagan dead. Some barrows received Christian names and Christian crosses, becoming pilgrimage sites where the faithful could pray safely for the intercession of canonized martyrs, rather than risk commerce with the unquiet dead. But the stones remember older blessings. At the Hill of Tara in Ireland, seat of the High Kings, the ancient burial mounds wear their Christian crosses like uncomfortable jewelry, the metal dark with age and weather, while the pagan carvings beneath remain as sharp as the day they were cut. The Leofale, the stone of destiny, still stands at the hill's heart, and despite centuries of Christian ritual, it is said to cry out when the true King of Ireland sets foot upon it, a voice from the pagan past that no amount of holy water has managed to silence. In Wales, the situation grew more complex. The hollow hills that had once belonged purely to the Tylwyth Teg were gradually colonized by Christian saints, each one claiming dominion over mounds that had been sacred for millennia. St. David's Hill, St. Buno's Mound, the Barrow of St. Non. The landscape became a palimpsest where Christian devotion was written over pagan reverence but never quite managed to erase what lay beneath. The result was a curious form of religious syncretism where Christian prayers and pagan offerings existed side by side. Pilgrims would climb the ancient mounds to pray at the Christian shrines built atop them, but they would also leave flowers for the fair folk and pour libations for the dead. The priests might disapprove, but the people understood something the church did not: that sacred ground accumulates sanctity rather than trading one form for another. The Christian dead could coexist with the pagan dead, the saints with the Tuatha De Danann, the cross with the spiral, because the hill itself was large enough to hold all forms of reverence. The seasonal rhythm of hill rituals created a calendar that ran parallel to the Christian year, but never quite synchronized with it. Imbolc fires on the barrows to welcome the returning light. Beltane dances around the mounds to celebrate fertility and growth. Lughnasadh offerings to ensure the harvest's success. Samhain flames to honor the dead and thin the veil between worlds. Each festival required its own specific observances, its own offerings, its own careful attention to the details that kept the compact between living and dead in good repair. The people who maintained these traditions understood that ritual is not mere superstition, but technology, a precise method for accomplishing specific spiritual tasks. Light a fire on a barrow at the right time in the right way, and you opened a channel of communication with the dead. Walk the circuit of a mound in the correct direction while carrying the proper offering, and you could secure blessings for your family, your livestock, your crops. Neglect the seasonal observances or perform them incorrectly, and you risked not just the loss of protection, but active hostility from powers that had grown accustomed to human respect. This was practical magic, as pragmatic as farming and as necessary as breathing. The hill rituals were not expressions of primitive ignorance, but sophisticated spiritual engineering, developed over centuries of experimentation and refined through generations of practice. They worked because they had to work, because communities that failed to maintain proper relationships with the dead rarely survived long enough to pass their negligence on to their children. The offerings evolved with the times, but retained their essential character. Bronze Age grave goods gave way to Iron Age weapons, which gave way to medieval coins, which gave way to modern flowers and food. But the underlying transaction remained constant. The living acknowledged their debt to the dead, and the dead provided what protection they could against the uncertainties of mortal existence. Some barrows developed reputations for specific types of intercession: the Mound of the Mothers for help with childbirth, the Hill of the Warriors for protection in battle, the Barrow of the Wise for guidance in difficult decisions. These specializations emerged from the character of those buried within, or from the character attributed to them by generations of supplicants whose prayers had been answered or whose offerings had been accepted. The physical evidence of these ongoing relationships can still be seen today. Ancient mounds whose surfaces are worn smooth by centuries of ritual circumambulation. Standing stones polished by countless hands leaving countless offerings. Hollows in the earth where generations of worshippers have knelt to whisper their prayers to the patient dead. The landscape itself bears witness to the persistence of belief, the stubborn human refusal to accept that death severs all connections between the living and the departed. But the hill rituals were not just about individual supplication, they were also about community identity, about the shared relationship between a people and their place. The mounds served as gathering points where scattered settlements came together to renew their bonds with each other and with the land they shared. The seasonal fires were signals visible for miles, announcements that this community still existed, still remembered, still honored the ancient compact with those who had come before. During times of crisis, plague, famine, war, invasion, the hill rituals took on desperate urgency. The offerings increased, the fires burned brighter, the circumambulations continued longer into the night. Communities under threat turned to their dead not out of superstition, but out of practical necessity, because the ancestors were the ultimate insurance policy, the final court of appeal when all earthly resources had been exhausted. The medieval chronicles record moments when the hill fires became acts of defiance. When Viking raiders threatened the coast, the barrow flames blazed in patterns that warned of approaching ships. When Norman soldiers advanced on Irish settlements, the mounds lit up like beacons, calling for supernatural aid. When English armies marched through Wales, The hollow hills flickered with lights that had nothing to do with earthly fire and everything to do with the wakening wrath of the Tylwyth Teg. These were not mere symbolic gestures, but tactical decisions, based on the hard-won knowledge that the dead could be powerful allies when properly approached. The hill rituals were diplomacy conducted with the otherworld, statecraft practiced across the boundary between life and death. As Christianity consolidated its power, the more obviously pagan elements of the hill rituals went underground. The great public gatherings became smaller, more secretive meetings. The fires that had once blazed openly on the barrows became hidden flames kindled in remote locations. The offerings that had once been left proudly at the bases of standing stones were hidden in crevices and hollows where prying clerical eyes were unlikely to find them. But the traditions survived, in the folk customs that persist to this day, in the flowers left anonymously on certain hills at certain times of year, in the paths worn around ancient mounds by walkers who may not consciously know why they feel compelled to complete the circuit, but follow their instincts anyway, in the local knowledge that marks certain barrows as places where wishes come true, where lovers meet, where the grieving go to feel closer to those they have lost. The ritual relationship between the living and the dead has proven more durable than any individual religion, more persistent than any political system. It adapts to new circumstances, finds new forms of expression, discovers new ways to maintain the ancient compact. The hill fires may burn less frequently now. The offerings may be flowers instead of food. The circumambulations may be called walks instead of rituals, but the essential transaction continues. The dead still listen. The hills still remember. And somewhere in the space between what we call superstition and what we call faith, between what we call past and what we call present, the ancient conversation continues in the only language that matters, the language of respect, remembrance, and the acknowledgement that some relationships transcend the boundary between life and death. On quiet evenings, when the wind is right and the mind is still, you can almost hear it, the whisper of voices that have been waiting in the darkness for someone to remember their names, to honor their sacrifice, to kindle a flame that pierces the veil between worlds and proves that love is stronger than death, that memory is more durable than stone, and that some compacts, once made, endure until the end of all things. The fires bloom on the hilltops when October dies, and the dead, patient in their barrows, lean forward in their stone chairs to feel the warmth on their faces once more. The barrow should not be opened. This warning echoes through the centuries like a curse passed down in whispers, grandmother to granddaughter, shepherd to shepherd, each generation adding its own terrible confirmation to the wisdom of the ages. The mounds can be approached with respect, circled with reverence, crowned with seasonal fires. But they must not be broken. They must not be opened. They must not be disturbed, because the earth remembers everything, and some memories bite back. In the autumn of 1849, Thomas Bateman arrived in Derbyshire with all the confidence of Victorian scholarship, and none of the caution that local knowledge might have provided. He was an antiquarian, one of those gentleman scholars who descended on ancient sites with shovels and notebooks, determined to drag the past into the light, regardless of what preferred to remain buried. The barrow on Gib Hill beckoned to him across the moorland like a green question mark against the sky, and he was certain he could provide the answers. The local farmers warned him away. "That mound's best left alone," they said, their faces carrying the weight of stories too old to have beginnings. Strange things happen to those who disturb it. Bad luck follows them home. But Bateman was a man of science, and science had no patience for peasant superstitions. He ordered his workmen to begin digging. They found treasure, just as he had hoped. Bronze daggers green with age, golden torques that caught the sunlight like captured fire, pottery urns filled with ash and bone. But they also found something else, something that the careful catalogues of Victorian archaeology never quite managed to explain. The workers began falling ill. Not all at once, not in any pattern that medicine could diagnose, but one by one, as if something in the barrow was methodically selecting its victims. By winter, 3 men were dead. By spring, Bateman himself had succumbed to a fever that burned through him like wildfire, leaving him raving about voices in the walls and shadows that moved against the light. His notebooks, found after his death, contained increasingly erratic entries, careful archaeological observations giving way to fevered speculation about malevolent influences and ancient curses. The final entry, written in a hand that barely resembled his earlier precise script, consisted of a single sentence repeated 17 times. The earth remembers. The earth remembers. The earth remembers. The treasure from Gib Hill was eventually sold to private collectors, scattered to the winds like seeds of misfortune. Every piece carried its own trail of tragedy. Families bankrupted, collectors dead before their time, museums plagued by inexplicable accidents, as if the grave goods themselves retained some fragment of the malevolence that had guarded them, some echo of the rage that comes from having one's rest disturbed by careless hands. This pattern repeats across the centuries, across continents, across cultures that had no contact with each other, but learned the same hard lessons about the price of disturbing the ancient dead. The warning changes languages but never changes meaning. The barrow should not be opened. In Ireland, they tell of Cormac O'Brien, who broke into the Great Mound at Newgrange in 1699, searching for the golden treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. He found the passage, crawled through the darkness to the central chamber, filled his pockets with ancient grave goods. But when he tried to leave, the passage had changed. Where before it had been straight and true, now it twisted like a serpent, leading him deeper into the hill instead of out toward the light. They found his body 3 days later at the entrance to the mound, his hair white as snow, though he had been young when he entered. His pockets were empty of treasure, filled instead with stones and clay. His eyes held the terrible knowledge of someone who had seen what waits in the deepest places, what dwells in the heart of the sacred hills when the sun sets and the old powers wake. The local people buried him in the churchyard, but would not speak his name aloud for fear of calling his attention back from whatever realm now claimed him. Because some transgressions echo across generations, and some debts are paid by the children of those who incurred them. The warnings persist because the consequences persist. In Wales, the farmers around Bryn Celli Du tell of the cursed field that lies adjacent to the ancient passage grave. Every family that has tried to farm that particular plot of land has met with disaster. Crops that fail despite favourable weather, livestock that sicken and die, children who fall ill with fevers that no doctor can cure. The field changes hands regularly, sold by desperate farmers to hopeful newcomers who ignore the warnings and learn the truth too late. The curse, they say, dates back to 1865, when a local landowner decided to use stones from the passage grave to build a new wall around his property. The ancient megaliths made excellent building material, solid, weathered, already cut to useful sizes. What could be the harm in repurposing stones that had served their purpose millennia ago? The harm became apparent within weeks. The landowners' prize cattle began dying one by one, their bodies found in the morning with no marks of violence, but with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. His sheep developed a peculiar madness, running in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion. His horses refused to cross the field where the stolen stones had been used, rearing and backing away as if they could see something human eyes could not. The landowner himself began experiencing what he described in letters to relatives as a persistent sensation of being watched. He would wake in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was standing beside his bed, but when he lit the lamp, nothing was there except shadows that seemed to move with purpose of their own. His wife reported voices in the walls, not the settling sounds that old houses make, but actual voices, speaking in a language she could not understand, but that filled her with inexplicable dread. Within a year, the family had fled their home, abandoning the property to whatever forces they had unknowingly awakened. The house still stands empty today, its windows boarded up, its roof beginning to sag. The field remains uncultivated, a patch of waste ground in the midst of otherwise productive farmland. And the stones from the passage grave lie where they fell when the fleeing family tore down the cursed wall, moss-covered and patient, waiting for someone to return them to their proper place. But not everyone who disturbs the ancient mounds does so out of greed or ignorance. Some are driven by academic curiosity, others by religious fervor, still others by the simple human need to understand what their ancestors believed and why. The mounds do not discriminate in their responses. Intent matters less than action, and the action of breaking into the sacred places always carries consequences. The excavation of Maisho in Orkney provides a particularly well-documented example of how even careful, respectful archaeology can awaken sleeping powers. In 1861, James Farrar led a team of workers into the Neolithic Passage tomb, following proper Victorian archaeological procedures and maintaining meticulous records of everything they found. They discovered that they were not the first to enter the ancient chamber. 12th century Norse raiders had broken in before them, leaving runic graffiti scratched into the stone walls. The runic inscriptions told their own story of disturbance and consequence. Ingigirth is the most beautiful of all women, read one carving, apparently the work of a lovesick Viking. But others were darker. These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean. Many a woman has come stooping in here, however pompous she might be. Hakon alone bore treasure from this howe. But scattered among the boastful inscriptions were warnings that suggested the Norse intruders had encountered something unexpected in the depths of the mound. This howe was built before Ragnarok, read one runic message. Lucky is he who might find the great treasure. Another, carved in what appeared to be a different, more urgent hand, simply said, "Some came mad from the howe." Farrar's excavation proceeded without obvious supernatural incident, but the aftermath proved troubling. Several of his workmen reported persistent nightmares about being trapped underground. One developed a phobia of enclosed spaces so severe that he could no longer work indoors. Another began claiming that he could hear voices speaking in an unknown language whenever he was alone in quiet places. Farrar himself remained skeptical of such reports until he began experiencing his own difficulties. His detailed archaeological notes, initially models of Victorian precision, gradually became erratic and obsessive. He developed a compulsion to return to Maisho again and again, spending hours alone in the chamber, measuring and remeasuring the same stones, searching for some pattern that always seemed just beyond his comprehension. His final journal entry, dated 3 months after the excavation's completion, reveals a mind grappling with forces beyond its understanding. There is something in the stones themselves, some quality that conventional scholarship cannot quantify. The runes speak of treasure, but I believe the true treasure is knowledge. Knowledge that was deliberately hidden, deliberately protected by barriers both physical and spiritual. The ancients who built Maisho were not primitive savages, but sophisticated architects of mysteries we are only beginning to comprehend. What they placed within the mound was not meant for casual discovery. Perhaps it was not meant for discovery at all. Farrar died the following winter, officially of pneumonia, but those who knew him claimed he had been failing since the excavation, growing thin and distant, as if some essential part of him had been left behind in the ancient chamber. His personal effects included dozens of sketches of spiral patterns, all drawn with obsessive precision, all variations on the carvings he had found within Maisho. He had filled an entire notebook with attempts to decode the spiral's meaning, pages and pages of calculations and theories that grew increasingly desperate and incoherent as they progressed. The patterns repeat across centuries and continents, but they are not limited to formal archaeological excavations. Sometimes the disturbance is accidental, a farmer ploughing too deep and striking ancient stones, a construction crew breaking through into a forgotten burial chamber, children at play inadvertently opening a sealed entrance. The response is always proportional to the intrusion, but it is also always disproportionate to the intent. In Brittany, The great dolmens and passage graves carry their own accumulation of warnings and curses. Local farmers know which fields to avoid, which stones not to move, which hollow places in the landscape mark the boundaries of territories that belong to older, darker powers. The knowledge is passed down, not through formal education, but through the practical wisdom of families who have farmed the same land for generations and learned to read the signs that mark safe ground from dangerous. The signs are subtle but unmistakable once you know how to see them. Patches of ground where crops grow differently, sometimes lusher, sometimes sparser, always wrong in some way that catches the eye. Springs that run clear all year, except on certain nights when the water turns dark and carries a taste like iron and old bones. Corners of fields where animals refuse to graze, where even weeds struggle to take root, where the earth itself seems to radiate a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature. These are the places where the ancient dead maintain their most jealous watch, where the boundary between worlds remains most fragile, where the slightest disturbance can tear holes in reality that take generations to heal. The farmers who know these places treat them like unmarked graves, like unexploded ordnance, like sleeping giants that must not be awakened. They plow around them, build around them, plan their lives around the accommodation of powers that predate Christianity, predate history, predate perhaps even human memory itself. But every generation produces those who refuse to be bound by ancestral wisdom, who mistake tradition for superstition and caution for cowardice. They clear the taboo patches of land, move the warning stones, dig into the places that have been left alone since time immemorial. And every generation learns anew why some boundaries should not be crossed, why some sleeping things should be left to their rest, why the ancient warnings were written in the first place. The land remembers every intrusion, every violation, every careless hand that disturbed what was meant to remain undisturbed. It remembers in the strange dreams that haunt those who live too close to desecrated sites. It remembers in the accidents that cluster around certain locations like iron filings drawn to a magnet. It remembers in the persistent sensation of being watched that follows some people home from places they never should have visited. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, it remembers out loud, in voices that rise from the opened barrows like smoke from fires that cast no light, in warnings that echo across the centuries in languages that have been dead for millennia, but somehow remain comprehensible to anyone foolish enough to listen. The barrow should not be opened, the stones should not be moved, the ancient dead should be left to their rest, because the earth remembers everything, and some memories, once awakened, refuse to sleep again. Deep calls to deep. Each burial mound is a doorway, but every doorway leads somewhere. The ancient builders who raised their hills of earth and stone were not just creating tombs, but mapping territories, marking the entrances to realms that stretch beneath the world like roots beneath a tree. The hills are not separate kingdoms, but embassies of a greater power, outposts of the underworld itself, places where the authority of the depths extends into the realm of light and air. To understand the mounds, you must understand what they connect to. To comprehend the power that sleeps beneath the green hills, you must journey deeper than any archaeologist's spade can reach, deeper than any Victorian antiquarian dared to go. You must descend into the mythic geography of the underworld itself, into the primal landscape of death and rebirth that every culture has mapped in its own tongue. But that remains, always, the same fundamental territory. The Norse called it Hel, and they knew it was both a place and a person. The goddess who ruled the dead from her hall Eljudnir, built from the bones of those who died of sickness or old age, rather than in glorious battle. Hel was half living, half corpse, her face beautiful on one side and rotting on the other, embodying the dual nature of death as both ending and transformation. She dwelt beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, in a realm accessible only through specific passages, caves, wells, and burial mounds that served as her doorways into the world above. The burial mounds of Scandinavia were understood to be such passages, temporary embassies where Hel's authority extended into Midgard. When the Vikings spoke of Wights dwelling in their grave hills, they were acknowledging that these mounds were territories of the death goddess herself, places where her laws superseded those of the living world. To break into a barrow was not just grave robbery, but trespass into a foreign kingdom whose ruler was older than the gods and less forgiving than the elements. But Hel was not evil, any more than winter is evil or sleep is evil. She was necessary, the force that received what life expelled, that transformed what the upper world discarded, that gave meaning to mortality by providing its inevitable destination. The dead who came to her halls were not punished, but transformed, becoming part of the great cycle that turns from life to death to life again. The Wights who guarded the ancient graves were her agents in this work, ensuring that the boundary between worlds remained properly maintained and that the traffic between life and death followed the ancient protocols. The Greeks understood this same truth but painted it in different colors. Their underworld was Hades, named for its ruler, a realm of shadows and silver rivers where the dead continued a different kind of existence beneath the roots of the world. Like Hel, Hades was not evil, but inevitable, the gravitational center toward which all mortal things eventually fell. And like the Norse, the Greeks recognized that certain places in the upper world served as gateways to these deeper territories. The necropolises of ancient Greece were built on hills for precisely this reason. The burial grounds at Kerameikos in Athens, the tomb complexes at Mycenae, the underground chambers carved into the hillsides of Crete, all were understood to be threshold spaces where the authority of Hades extended upward into the realm of the living. The dead buried in these places were not cut off from the world they had left, but remained connected to it through the network of passages that linked every grave to the greater underworld. This is why the Greek dead were buried with coins, not just payment for Charon's ferry across the river Styx, but recognition that they were traveling to a place with its own economy, its own social structures, its own complex relationships between ruler and subject. The underworld was not a void, but a kingdom, and kingdoms require tribute, negotiation, and careful attention to protocol. The Celtic understanding was perhaps the most sophisticated of all, recognizing not just that the hills connected to an underworld, but that the underworld itself was layered, complex, containing multiple territories ruled by different powers for different purposes. The otherworld of Celtic mythology was not a single destination, but a network of interconnected realms, Anwyen Tek Duin Tir na Nog, each accessible through specific entrances in the landscape above. The Sídhe Mounds were the most important of these entrances, but they were not the only ones. Wells, caves, certain groves of trees, islands that appeared and disappeared with the tides, all served as doorways to the deeper territories. But the burial hills held special significance because they were marked by human intention, sanctified by human sacrifice, claimed by human will as permanent embassies between the worlds. This is why the Celtic dead did not simply disappear into an afterlife, but remained active participants in the ongoing relationship between the living and the otherworld. They became ambassadors, intermediaries, guides for those who needed to navigate the complex diplomatic relationships between the realm of the living and the various kingdoms of the dead. The fairy courts that held their revels in the hollow hills were not just entertainment, but governing bodies, making decisions that affected both worlds, maintaining the delicate balance that kept the boundaries stable and the passages clear. But perhaps the most profound understanding came from recognizing that the underworld was not just the realm of the dead, but the womb of the earth itself, the place from which all life emerged and to which all life returned. This was the deepest wisdom of the ancient builders, the knowledge that made their mounds into more than just graves or gateways, but into symbols of the fundamental process by which death becomes life, by which endings become beginnings, by which what appears to be lost is actually transformed. The goddess who ruled this womb realm had many names: Hel in the north, Persephone in the south, Brigid in the west, Ereshkigal in the east. But always she was the same essential figure, the feminine principle of death and rebirth, the dark mother who receives her children into the earth and births them again as something new. The burial mounds were her temples, the grave goods were her offerings, and the dead who dwelt within were her priests and priestesses, maintaining the ancient rites that kept the great cycle turning. This is why so many burial mounds are oriented toward the rising sun at significant moments in the year: the winter solstice at Newgrange, the equinoxes at countless other sites across Europe. The builders understood that the underworld was not separate from the cosmic order, but integral to it, that the cycles of death and rebirth in the depths below mirrored the cycles of darkness and light in the heavens above. The mounds were built to capture these moments of transition, to allow the dead to participate in the eternal dance of sun and season that governs all terrestrial life. At Newgrange, when the winter solstice light penetrates the passage and illuminates the bones in the central chamber, it is not just archaeological accident, but spiritual engineering of the highest order. The light is not just illuminating the dead, but awakening them, calling them back to participation in the world above, renewing their connection to the realm of the living. For 17 minutes, the boundary between worlds dissolves, and the dead remember what it was like to be alive, while the living glimpse what it will mean to be dead. This understanding transforms everything we think we know about the purpose of burial mounds. They were not just tombs or monuments, but active participants in the cosmic machinery that governs the relationship between life and death. They were temples dedicated to the goddess of the underworld, embassies of the realm below, and schools where the living could learn the mysteries of transformation that govern all existence. The seasonal myths that grew up around these sites reflect this deeper understanding. Persephone's annual journey to the underworld and back, Balder's death and prophesied resurrection, the endless cycle of vegetation gods who die in winter and return in spring. All are stories about the fundamental process that the burial mounds were built to facilitate. The hills are not just graves, but birthplaces, not just endings, but beginnings, not just monuments to the dead, but laboratories where the living can study the mysteries of renewal. This is why the dead in the mounds are not silent but active, not absent but present, not powerless but influential. They have become part of the machinery of transformation itself, agents of the great goddess who rules the womb of the earth. They speak not from memory, but from ongoing experience, not from the past, but from the eternal present, where death and life dance together in the rhythm that underlies all existence. The underground rivers that flow through the mythic landscape of the underworld, Styx, Lethe, Acheron in the Greek tradition, the rivers of Anduin in Celtic lore, these are not just features of the otherworld, but arteries through which the power of transformation flows. Every burial mound taps into this network, connects to this system, draws from this source. The dead who dwell in the hills are not cut off from the flow of existence, but have become part of its deeper currents, the underground streams that nourish all life from below. This is why disturbing the mounds is not just disrespectful, but dangerous. It disrupts connections that have been carefully maintained for millennia, breaks circuits that carry power between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The consequences are not just supernatural, but ecological, disruptions in the fundamental processes that govern the relationship between death and life, ending and beginning, what was and what will be. The builders of the ancient mounds understood something that we have forgotten, that the underworld is not the opposite of the world above, but its foundation, its root system, its source of renewal. The dead are not gone, but transformed, not absent, but differently present, not powerless, but operating according to different laws and wielding different kinds of influence. The hills they built are not just markers of this understanding, but active expressions of it, machines designed to facilitate the ongoing conversation between the worlds, temples where the ancient wisdom can still be accessed by those who approach with proper reverence and genuine need. They are proof that death is not the end of the story, but its transformation into a different kind of story, one told not in words, but in the slow, patient language of stone and earth and the eternal cycle of seasons. In the darkness beneath the hills, in the chambers where bones lie arranged like libraries of memory, in the passages that lead deeper than any living person should go, the great work continues. The dead serve their apprenticeship to the goddess of the underworld, learning the mysteries of transformation that they will eventually teach to others. The womb of the earth nurtures what appears to be lifeless, preparing it for a different kind of birth, a different kind of existence, a different kind of power. And sometimes, on nights when the boundaries grow thin and the old connections reassert themselves, the living can feel it. That vast presence moving in the depths, that ancient intelligence stirring in the darkness, that primordial force that transforms every ending into a beginning, every death into a doorway, every grave into a womb preparing to give birth to something new. The hills remember what we have forgotten, that we come from the dark and will return to it, but the darkness is not empty. It is full of potential, pregnant with possibility, alive with the patient love of the Earth Mother, who receives all her children home and prepares them for the next phase of their eternal journey. They are still there. In the misty dawn light that filters through the Boyne Valley, Newgrange rises from the Irish landscape, like a green breast offered to the sky. 5,000 years have passed since human hands last placed stones in its walls. Yet something about the mound refuses to settle into the comfortable silence of ancient history. Visitors speak of sensations that have no rational explanation. Sudden temperature drops in the passage. The feeling of being watched from empty chambers, sounds that might be wind in stone crevices, or might be something else entirely. The archaeologists maintain their scientific distance, cataloguing and measuring and dating with the precision of modern scholarship. But the locals know better. They know that some places exist outside the normal flow of time, that certain hills hold conversations with every century that passes over them, that the ancient dead are not as silent as the scholarly papers suggest. Walk the fields around Newgrange at sunset, and you will see them. Not tourists or archaeologists, but other visitors, people who come not to study but to listen, to pay respects, to maintain relationships that began before Christ was born, and show no signs of ending now that the third millennium has begun. They leave flowers at the base of the mound, not in any organized fashion, but as private offerings, personal acknowledgements of something that dwells within the hill and has been listening to human sorrows and celebrations for longer than any living tradition can remember. The flowers are always gone by morning, not withered, not scattered by wind, simply gone, as if the earth itself had drawn them down into some deeper purpose. The groundskeepers find no trace of them, but the offerings continue, season after season, year after year, placed by hands that understand what the official guidebooks do not. That Newgrange is not just a historical monument, but a living temple, where the ancient compact between the living and the dead remains in force. This pattern repeats across the ancient landscape of Europe. At Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, the largest artificial mound in the continent, no burial has ever been found despite repeated excavations. Yet the hill draws pilgrims who cannot explain their compulsion to climb its slopes, to sit in the grass at its summit, to listen to something that speaks not in words, but in the deep silence that underlies all noise. They come seeking, they know not what, and leave, carrying, they know not what. Marked by an encounter with something that has been waiting in the hill since before the Romans learned to build roads. The official interpretation boards speak of Neolithic engineering and prehistoric social organization, but they cannot explain why certain people weep when they first see the hill, why others feel an overwhelming urge to return again and again, why children sometimes point to the mound and ask about the people inside, when there are no people visible to adult eyes. Science can measure the hill's dimensions and carbon date its construction, but it cannot quantify the presence that dwells within, cannot capture in its instruments the patient attention that has been focused on the world above for over 4,000 years. At West Kennet Long Barrow, the great stone chambers that once held the bones of Neolithic communities now lie officially empty, their ancient occupants long since relocated to museum storage. But the mound itself remembers what was taken from it, remembers the generations who made pilgrimage to these chambers, remembers the conversations between the living and the dead that continued for millennia after the original builders had joined their ancestors in the darkness below. Modern visitors report experiences that the guidebooks do not mention. The sudden sense of stepping into a vast underground cathedral when entering the narrow passages. The feeling that the stone chambers are not empty, but full of an invisible congregation. The way sound behaves strangely inside the barrow, carrying whispers that seem to come from the stones themselves. The persistent sensation of being part of a ceremony that began before they arrived and will continue after they leave. These are not ghost stories in the conventional sense, not tales of specific spirits haunting specific locations. They are encounters with something deeper and more pervasive, the accumulated presence of every human being who ever regarded these hills as sacred, every offering left at their bases, every prayer whispered in their shadows. The mounds have become repositories, not just of bones, but of human attention, storehouses of reverence that have been building for millennia and show no signs of diminishing. The conservation of these sites presents challenges that extend beyond the merely archaeological. How do you preserve places that are valued not just for their historical significance, but for their ongoing spiritual function? How do you balance scientific study with traditional respect? How do you protect monuments that are sacred not because they are old, but because they are still alive? English Heritage, the organisation responsible for maintaining many of Britain's ancient sites, has learned to work within the constraints of beliefs it does not officially acknowledge. Certain barrows are left unexcavated, not because they lack archaeological interest, but because local communities have made their opposition to disturbance clear in ways that transcend formal planning procedures. Flowers are allowed to remain at the bases of ancient stones, longer than bureaucratic tidiness might normally permit. Seasonal celebrations are accommodated even when they have no official sanction. The staff who work at these sites develop their own understanding, born of daily proximity to places that exist at the intersection of history and mystery. They speak privately of mounds that feel different on certain days, of stones that seem to radiate warmth or cold independent of weather conditions, of the way some visitors are drawn to specific chambers while others are repelled by them. They learn to read the signs that indicate when a place is welcoming to human presence and when it prefers to be left alone. At Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, where the ship burial of an Anglo-Saxon king was discovered in 1939, the excavated mound still draws visitors who come not to see the empty grave, but to pay respects to something that remains present despite the removal of its physical contents. The burial chamber may be bare earth now, but the hill itself retains the imprint of royal authority, the sense of a presence that once commanded the respect of armies and still commands the attention of those sensitive enough to feel it. The museum built to house the treasures from Sutton Hoo displays golden artifacts of extraordinary beauty, helmet and sword pommel, buckles and bowls worked with the skill of master craftsmen. But the objects in their glass cases feel strangely diminished, beautiful but somehow hollow, like exquisite shells from which the living creature has departed. The power that once animated them remains in the hill where they were found, in the mound that shaped them into a coherent whole, in the landscape that gave them meaning. This displacement of sacred objects from their sacred contexts has become one of the great unacknowledged tragedies of modern archaeology. Museums filled with grave goods torn from their proper settings, treasures reduced to curiosities, ritual objects transformed into art. The mounds from which these artifacts were taken often develop reputations for being somehow incomplete, wounded, diminished by the loss of their contents. But the hills adapt. They find new ways to assert their presence, new methods for maintaining the ancient conversation between the living and the dead. They work through the people who visit them, planting seeds of wonder and reverence that bloom into lifelong fascination. They influence the dreams of those who sleep within their sphere of influence, sending visions that are part memory, part prophecy, part invitation to participate in mysteries older than civilization. The phenomenon is not limited to the famous sites, the ones that appear on tourist maps and heritage trails. In the countryside of Britain and Ireland, France and Scandinavia, anonymous barrows and forgotten dolmens continue their patient vigil in farmers' fields and country parks. Many are unmarked, their only identification the local knowledge that passes from one generation to the next in whispers and warnings. These are often the most potent of the ancient sites, uncontaminated by commercial tourism, undiminished by academic interpretation, raw in their power and direct in their communication with those who approach them properly. The farmers who work around these sites develop relationships with them that span decades. They learn which mounds prefer to be left alone and which welcome human proximity. They notice patterns in their crops, how certain areas around ancient sites produce different yields, how livestock behave differently when grazing near burial hills, how the weather seems to change in subtle ways as it passes over sacred ground. Some farmers leave offerings, not from any conscious religious belief, but from practical recognition that certain places require specific forms of respect. A thermos of tea left at the base of a standing stone, flowers placed on a barrow at the changing of seasons, coins pressed into crevices in ancient masonry. The currency changes, but the transaction remains the same. Acknowledgement that these places are not ordinary landscape, but something more complex, more demanding, more worthy of careful attention. The old traditions adapt to new circumstances, but never disappear entirely. In rural Ireland, farmers still walk sunwise around certain mounds when moving cattle through adjacent fields. In Wales, hikers report feeling compelled to complete circuits of ancient cairns encountered on mountain paths. In Scotland, the custom of leaving small stones atop ancient burial monuments continues, each pebble a prayer, each addition a contribution to cairns that have been growing for millennia. The modern pagan revival has brought new attention to these ancient sites, but it has also revealed how much genuine tradition has survived in forms that are not officially recognized as religious practice. The neo-pagan ceremonies that take place at stone circles and burial mounds often feel like rediscoveries of practices that never really stopped, like formal expression of relationships that have been maintained informally by local communities for generations. But the hills are selective in their responses. They seem to distinguish between authentic reverence and performed spirituality, between visitors who come seeking genuine connection and those who come seeking exotic experience. The ancient sites reveal themselves gradually, sharing their secrets only with those who demonstrate sustained commitment, genuine respect, and the patience to listen rather than demand. This selectivity has created communities of devotees around many ancient sites, informal networks of people who return repeatedly to the same mounds, who develop personal relationships with specific places, who serve as unofficial guardians of traditions that predate any organized religion. They are not priests or priestesses in any formal sense, but they maintain the ancient roles of intermediary between the human community and the powers that dwell in the sacred hills. These modern devotees often report experiences that mirror those described in medieval chronicles and folklore. Dreams of underground halls filled with figures from the distant past, visions of landscapes as they existed before human modification, encounters with presences that feel simultaneously ancient and immediate, familiar and utterly alien, messages delivered in symbols rather than words, in sensations rather than sounds, in sudden knowledge that arrives without explanation but proves accurate in application. The scholarly response to such reports ranges from polite skepticism to careful documentation. Some archaeologists have begun to acknowledge that the experiential dimension of ancient sites provides information that conventional analysis cannot access. They speak cautiously of phenomenological archaeology, of the value of subjective response in understanding how ancient peoples might have experienced the monuments they built. Others maintain strict scientific distance, arguing that subjective experience cannot be quantified and therefore cannot contribute to genuine understanding of the past. But even the most rigorous materialists sometimes find themselves affected by prolonged exposure to ancient sites, developing intuitive responses that their training cannot explain, but their experience cannot deny. The hills themselves seem indifferent to academic controversy. They continue their patient work of memory and transformation, accepting offerings from believers and skeptics alike, revealing their secrets according to laws older than any human institution. They adapt to each new century while remaining fundamentally unchanged, speaking to each generation in the language it best understands, while preserving truths that transcend any single cultural expression. In the digital age, the ancient sites have found new ways to extend their influence. Photographs taken at sacred locations often capture anomalies that photographers cannot explain. Lights that appear in no other images, shadows that fall in impossible directions, figures glimpsed at the edges of frames, but invisible to direct observation. Videos recorded at ancient sites sometimes contain sounds that microphones should not have been able to capture. Voices speaking in languages that listeners cannot identify but somehow understand. These digital ghosts, these electronic emanations from places of ancient power, suggest that the hills have learned to work with technologies their builders could never have imagined. They adapt their methods but not their essential nature, finding new channels for the same eternal communication between the living and the dead that began when the first human being placed the first stone in reverence and hope. The question that haunts every serious study of these places is whether the phenomena associated with them represent genuine contact with the past or psychological projection onto ambiguous stimuli. Do the hills actually contain some form of preserved consciousness, some residual presence of those who built them and those who are buried within them? Or do they simply provide a focus for human needs and desires that exist independently of any supernatural agency? Perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps the distinction between objective and subjective reality dissolves at the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between the material world and the realm of consciousness that gives it meaning. Perhaps the hills work precisely because they exist at the intersection of these categories, serving as bridges between different kinds of existence that our language struggles to distinguish, but our experience knows to be intimately connected. What cannot be disputed is that the ancient burial mounds continue to affect people in ways that conventional explanation cannot adequately address. They remain active elements in the landscape, exerting influence that extends far beyond their physical presence, maintaining relationships with human visitors that span generations and transcend cultural boundaries. The archaeologists who excavate them, the conservators who maintain them, the tourists who visit them, the locals who live near them, all develop their own ways of acknowledging the presence that dwells within the sacred hills. Some speak of it directly, others hint at it obliquely, still others deny it entirely while unconsciously modifying their behavior to accommodate it. But the presence itself remains constant, patient as the stones from which the mounds are built, enduring as the earth in which they are rooted, attentive as only the dead can be to the brief bright passages of the living. It watches from the darkness of burial chambers, listens from the silence of ancient corridors, waits in the patient earth for the next visitor who will approach with the proper mixture of respect and need. The hills still whisper, but only to those who remember how to listen. They still grant audience, but only to those who understand the protocols of approaches made across the boundaries between worlds. They still offer gifts, but only to those who recognize that some presents come with obligations, some knowledge comes with responsibility, some relationships, once begun, continue forever. In the end, the truth about the dead who never left is not a historical fact to be established or an archaeological puzzle to be solved, but a living reality to be engaged. The ancient builders succeeded in their great work beyond perhaps even their own expectations. They made their dead immortal, gave them power that transcends the boundaries of individual mortality, established their presence so firmly in the landscape that centuries of change cannot erode their influence. The dead beneath the hills have become something more than memory and less than resurrection, a form of existence that participates in both past and present, that bridges the human and the more than human, that continues the eternal conversation between what was, what is, and what yet might be. They are still there, in the green hills that rise from modern fields, like islands of eternity in a sea of time, still watching, still listening, still waiting for the next visitor who will remember the ancient courtesy, who will approach with the proper offerings, who will recognize that some conversations begun in one age continue in all ages, that some relationships transcend the boundaries of individual lives, that some presences, once established in the sacred landscape, endure as long as the earth itself. The hills still whisper, the dead still remember, and somewhere in the space between history and mystery, between what we know and what we feel, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, the ancient conversation continues in the only language that truly matters, the language of reverence, the dialect of wonder, the eternal exchange between those who remember and those who wish to be remembered. Listen carefully, and you can hear it still.